If you're ready to delve into Elizabeth Hartfield's story and follow her journey fighting for a more just world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this captivating narrative. Immerse yourself in every twist, mystery, and emotion as we explore how a woman can challenge the system and transform the future. Sign up now, join us on this epic adventure. Don't miss the updates and stay tuned for everything that's coming. It was the 1930s, a period of intense social, economic, and political transformation in the United States. At the center of this turmoil was Elizabeth Hartfield, a woman who defied all the conventions of her time. Born into a middle-class family in Chicago, she was not the type of woman to settle for the destiny society had prepared for her. While many of her contemporaries dreamed of a quiet marriage and a peaceful life, Elizabeth had a clear goal: power. But it wasn't just traditional power that women sought at the time. Her focus was on a more subtle, more encompassing kind of power: the ability to transform society and control the financial flows of a country emerging from the Great Depression. Young Elizabeth, already a respected figure in the business world at age 30, had a secret: her connection to one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures, Joseph Stalin. Although Russia was a distant and unknown land to most Americans, she had taken a trip that would change not only her life, but the destiny of an entire nation. During the 1920s, she had visited Moscow at the invitation of a Russian businessman, and on a dark and tense night, she had a private conversation with Stalin about the future of global economies. He knew that socialist policies could be a model for other nations, but he needed allies in the United States, allies who knew how to manage money, who mastered the capitalist system. Elizabeth then had not only survived the difficult years, but had also managed to infiltrate the most exclusive circles of Wall Street, forging connections with magnates and politicians who would later help reverse the financial fate of the United States. But behind her meteoric rise, there was something many did not understand: a revolutionary idea she believed to be the key to the country's prosperity. An economy that was not based solely on profit, but that was capable of distributing wealth more equitably. She had mastered the political manipulation techniques she had learned from Stalin, without ever revealing that her true loyalty lay in a more radical ideology. Over the years, she built a secret network of influential allies in Washington and New York, a financial operation hidden from most, but with a profound impact on the events that would follow. Elizabeth was no ordinary businesswoman. She was building an empire that reflected not only the increase of her personal wealth, but also the transformation of the American economy from within. While large banks and corporations were more focused on expanding their profits, she envisioned a new kind of economy, one where power was decentralized and more people could access wealth. However, there was an obstacle. The growing fear of communism in the United States generated distrust in any movement that threatened the status quo of capitalism. For many, a woman who approached Stalin could be seen as a traitor. But for Elizabeth, the real betrayal lay in ignoring the suffering of the masses and the injustices of the capitalist system. That night, when Stalin revealed his plans to her, Elizabeth not only listened, but absorbed them. When she returned to the United States, something within her had changed. She knew the country was on the cusp of a new era, and she prepared to be one of the leaders of that transformation. What she didn't know was that this journey would lead her to a series of encounters and betrayals that would change not only her life, but the financial history of the United States. Do you believe Elizabeth made the right decision in seeking power during such a turbulent time? What do you think of a businesswoman becoming involved with figures like Stalin to change the course of history? After the decisive meeting with Stalin, Elizabeth Hartfield returned to the United States, but the world she found around her was far from a favorable scenario for radical change. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression, And while the rich were rebuilding their lives in luxurious Manhattan homes, the lower classes struggled to stay afloat. However, Elizabeth knew that times were changing. The cards were being dealt, and she was no longer a spectator but an active player. The powerful figures of Wall Street were obsessed with rapid and uncontrolled economic growth. For them, immediate profit was the only measure of success. But Elizabeth knew that the deeper issues of the capitalist system needed to be addressed. There was a disconnect between the interests of the powerful and the needs of the people. She envisioned a change, a restructuring of the system, where wealth and power would not be concentrated in so few hands. However, to achieve this, she would need to confront a society deeply rooted in individualism and rampant consumerism. As she began to establish her network of financial allies, tensions rose. Her ability to maneuver in the highest spheres of politics and economics began to be noticed by powerful people, both within the government and among corporate magnates. They saw in Elizabeth a silent threat, a woman who not only defied gender norms, but was about to challenge the entire economic system that had sustained their wealth and status for generations. One of these people was Henry Jacobs, an unbeatable businessman with interests in banking and real estate, whose connections with key government figures gave him an immense advantage. Jacobs had a unique talent for manipulating markets and laws to his advantage. But what made him even more dangerous was his arrogance. He saw Elizabeth's rise as a direct threat to his own interests and would not hesitate to act to destroy her if necessary. However, Elizabeth's true enemy was not just Jacobs or other businessmen vying for financial dominance. Her greatest challenge was public perception. Americans, still traumatized by the 1929 financial crisis, were extremely suspicious of any move that could compromise the stability of the financial system. Upon realizing Elizabeth's involvement with foreign leaders, especially Stalin, she came to be seen by many as a traitor, a woman playing with fire by embracing communist ideals. This stigma quickly spread, and with it, a series of conspiracies arose, accusing her of being a foreign agent, a manipulator of the economy for interests beyond the borders of the United States. She knew she needed to protect herself, so she created an even more secret network of contacts within the government, business people, and even members of the military, willing to protect her interests and objectives. Amidst this turmoil, Elizabeth never lost sight of what she most desired: to create a new economic system that would be fairer and more accessible to all, without the excesses that characterize the era of unchecked capitalism. But there was something even she hadn't expected: the emotional and personal difficulties that began to arise as she delved deeper into this world of manipulation and betrayal. Her loneliness grew as her enemies multiplied, and she didn't know who she could trust. At many moments, she felt torn between her mission to transform the country and the immense pressures that mission placed on her personal life. Although she was a woman of fierce determination, the loneliness of being one of the few in her position began to make her presence feel even heavier. During this time, a peculiar figure began to approach her: Leonid Petrov, a Russian immigrant who had arrived in the United States shortly after the Russian Revolution. Petrov was an intellectual, a former member of the Bolshevik Party who had fled Russia after Stalin's rise to power. He knew the intricacies of international politics and had a clear understanding of the connections between the United States and the Soviet Union. He saw in Elizabeth a kindred spirit, a woman who, like him, understood that true power lay not only in controlling material possessions, but in knowing how to manipulate the narrative, in controlling public perception. Together, Elizabeth and Leonid began to devise even bolder plans. While she gained strength in the financial world, he helped expand her network of political allies, introducing her to key figures in American politics. But there was something more. Petrov knew that to achieve the power they both desired, more than just financial alliances would be necessary. It would require shaping public opinion and the media. Elizabeth was at the center of an intricate web of alliances and betrayals, and now she needed to decide how far she was willing to go to achieve her goals. But something wasn't right. Stalin's words, which she had absorbed so deeply, began to reverberate in her mind in a darker way. She wondered if true change was possible within the system, or if, in the end, she too would be consumed by it. Do you think Elizabeth's loneliness and personal difficulties might influence her choices in the future? What would you do if you were in her place, facing so many enemies and such a risky mission? With her network of financial and political allies growing, Elizabeth Hartfield seemed increasingly unbeatable. She controlled the finances of several large corporations and had secretly established a series of investments in strategic sectors such as energy and transportation. Her discreet maneuvers were changing the economic landscape of the United States, but not everyone was unaware of her growing power. The first major obstacle arose when Henry Jacobs, the rival businessman, realized how much influence Elizabeth was gaining. He was unwilling to relinquish control over the financial markets he so thoroughly dominated. Jacobs, always meticulous and ruthless, decided that the only way to neutralize Elizabeth was to expose her, showing the public that she was not a trustworthy figure, but someone willing to align herself with communist regimes to achieve power. Jacobs launched a smear campaign. Using his network of contacts in the media and politics, he began spreading rumors about Elizabeth's involvement with foreign figures, primarily Stalin, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. To truly weaken her, he needed to attack her weakest point, her ability to control finances without raising suspicion. If he could expose her secret transactions, he could publicly destroy her. Elizabeth, on the other hand, knew that the winds were changing and that the war she was waging wasn't just about money, but about something much deeper. She needed to prepare for the political and economic battle that was about to begin. To that end, she intensified her alliances within the government and in the most exclusive circles of Wall Street, including influential people who had something to lose if the system were challenged. As the leader of a subversive financial movement, Elizabeth knew that time was against her. What she didn't expect, however, was Jacobs's strategic move, which had an ace up its sleeve. On a tense night, while Elizabeth was meeting with Leonid Petrov to discuss new expansion plans, a trusted ally rushed in with devastating news. The FBI had begun investigating her finances. The government, under mounting pressure due to accusations from its adversaries, was beginning to view Elizabeth as a threat. The investigation appeared to be just the beginning of a series of actions that could put her at risk. It was evident that Jacob's movement had borne fruit. Political power was uniting against her, and the United States government, with its growing distrust of communism and foreign influence, was determined to take drastic measures. The smear machine had worked. Elizabeth Hartfield was being portrayed as a traitor, attempting to subvert the country's economic and political order. However, Elizabeth, being a natural strategist, knew she couldn't simply wait passively. She needed to turn the tables. To do this, she decided to take a bold approach. She began using her own allies within the government and corporations to manipulate the flow of information. Instead of trying to hide the accusations, Elizabeth started using them as a tool for her own advancement. In a risky move, she began to approach government figures who opposed the growing fear of communism. She realized that the only way to avoid her downfall would be to ally herself with those already disillusioned with government policies. Elizabeth's alignment with these figures revealed a new facet of her character, her ability to be a political manipulator, as shrewd as any great leader she had ever studied. As external pressures mounted, Elizabeth also began to face growing internal conflict. Leonid, her confidant and Russian ally, was beginning to express concern about the direction she was taking. Elizabeth's transformation into such a calculating figure involved in political manipulation was beginning to affect their relationship. Leonid saw in her the same ambition that had destroyed many revolutionary leaders throughout history and feared she was losing sight of the essence of her mission. But Elizabeth could not turn back. She was so immersed in her struggle for power and economic transformation that she could no longer discern how far her own values still applied. She believed she was fighting for a greater good, but as the conflict intensified, she found herself further from her original vision of a just and accessible economic system. The alliances Elizabeth had formed were being tested to the extreme, and the looming political and economic war would demand more sacrifices than she had ever imagined. Jacobs and his political allies continued to pressure her from all sides, while she tried to strengthen herself with her own strategies. With the government now involved, the stakes were higher than ever. What had previously seemed like a business game was now becoming a battle of enormous proportions, where the consequences of each move could change not only Elizabeth's fate, but also the future of the American economy. Do you believe Elizabeth is losing her way by engaging in such risky political manipulations? Can she still achieve her goals without losing focus on her original mission? Elizabeth Hartfield's struggle to establish herself as the leader of a subversive and transformative movement was in full swing, but the chaos in her personal life and mounting external difficulties were beginning to affect the decisions she made. Amidst the battle for power and economic control, new subplots began to intertwine with her destiny, challenging her beliefs and placing her in unexpected situations. One of these subplots involved her relationship with Leonid Petrov. Although they initially had a strong ideological and intellectual connection, the tension between them increased as Elizabeth distanced herself from her original principles. Leonid, who had been a key figure in expanding her network of political allies, began to question Elizabeth's methods. He feared that, in seeking absolute power, she was becoming the very thing she had fought against, a manipulator, willing to do anything to achieve her goals. Their relationship was tested when Leonid, in desperation, asked her to reconsider her political alliances. "Elizabeth, you're going down a dangerous path," he said one cold winter night as she reviewed financial reports in her office. "These men you associate with, they're the same ones who once destroyed the world we believed in. Don't you see that anymore?" Lost in her own thoughts, she looked at him with a forced smile. "I see what they do, but they have the power, Leonid. And it is with that power that we will change everything." But as Elizabeth became increasingly withdrawn in her relentless pursuit of control, another character emerged in her life. Charles Montgomery, a Washington politician with deep ties to financial circles. Montgomery had closely followed Elizabeth's rise and was beginning to see her not only as a potential ally, but as a crucial figure in securing his own political advancement. Unlike Leonid, Charles knew how to use politics to his advantage, manipulating events around him with a cunning that made Elizabeth seem like an amateur. He sought out Elizabeth at a time when she was most vulnerable. He offered her an alliance that, at first glance, seemed to be a way for her to further consolidate her power. But Montgomery's true intentions were unclear. While Elizabeth grew increasingly ambitious, he was patient, waiting for the right moment to show her that in politics, no one was anyone's friend for very long. At the same time, Elizabeth faced increasing pressure within her own network of financial allies. Many began to question how far she was willing to go to ensure the success of her plans. Some, especially those with more personal interests, began to distance themselves, suspicious of her motives. There were rumors that she was straying from her original vision of a fairer and more accessible system, focusing exclusively on consolidating power for herself. These rumors further fueled Henry Jacobs's smear campaign, and Elizabeth's paranoia intensified. The truth was that she was becoming increasingly alone. Even with a network of allies, she couldn't fully trust anyone. The weight of leading such a risky movement was affecting her mental and emotional health. Sleepless nights became more and more frequent, and she began to question her own choices. As convinced as she was that she was doing what was necessary to transform the American economy, doubt about her true motivation began to gnaw at her spirit. On a particularly difficult night, Elizabeth had a conversation with one of her closest friends, Margaret, a renowned economist who had been one of the first to believe in her vision. Margaret, who had been a staunch supporter of Elizabeth from the beginning, was now beginning to feel that things were spiraling out of control. She warned her, "Elizabeth, you're losing control of what you started. We can't save the system by keeping all these secrets. What happened to the idea of a more transparent, fairer system?" Those words weighed like a sharp blade on Elizabeth's mind. She knew Margaret was right. But the problem was that now, the truth seemed far more complicated than she had imagined. To truly change the system, Elizabeth would have to confront not only her external enemies, but also the internal dilemmas that were forming within her own mind. Meanwhile, the political landscape was becoming even more volatile. Growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union meant that any move involving foreign figures, such as Stalin, was viewed with suspicion. The government, fearing a possible communist movement on American soil, began taking more aggressive measures against anyone who might pose a threat. The FBI intensified its investigations into Elizabeth's dealings, and rumors that she had direct connections to the Kremlin began to spread, further damaging her public image. Faced with all this pressure, Elizabeth found herself facing a difficult choice. Would she continue to pursue her goal, risking her personal life and her own morality, or would she take a safer path, distancing herself from the dirty game she herself had helped to create? How could she maintain the trust of her allies while simultaneously confronting the enemies who now surrounded her on all sides? Do you believe Elizabeth can still return to her original principles, or is it too late to redirect her destiny? How do you think she should deal with her personal relationships and external pressures? Elizabeth Hartfield's movement was about to reach a breaking point. External pressure, combined with internal conflicts, had created a tension that could no longer be ignored. The dilemma between her ambitions and her personal beliefs had now become untenable. She found herself facing an uncertain future where every decision could have irreparable consequences. And it was at this moment that an unexpected event forced her to make a decision that would change everything. The American government, driven by growing distrust of her connections to the Soviet Union, had intensified its investigations into her finances and alliances. The FBI, which had already been monitoring her transactions and movements, had obtained a bombshell. One of her most secret financial transactions was directly linked to a Russian businessman connected to the Kremlin. The secret she had carefully protected was now about to be exposed to the public. On a cold January morning, Elizabeth was summoned for questioning at the Capitol, where government officials and members of her rival network were waiting to confront her. She knew things had reached a critical point. The strategy she had used up to that point, manipulating information, forging secret alliances, and playing the political game, wouldn't be enough now. She needed something more, something she hadn't planned for. On the way to the Capitol, as the limousine cut through the icy streets of Washington, Elizabeth looked out the window, thinking about what had brought her there. She had always known that truth was a currency that could be manipulated as needed, but what was happening now was different. Her own loyalty was being questioned, and more importantly, she was beginning to realize that her mission to transform the American economy might have been distorted along the way. Those who were by her side now, like Charles Montgomery and other political allies, were more interested in preserving their own power than in seeking social justice or a more balanced system. From the moment she joined these men, Elizabeth had felt increasingly distant from her original vision. The line between good and evil was becoming increasingly blurred. Upon arriving at the interrogation site, Elizabeth was met with an atmosphere thick with distrust. Among the faces observing her were figures of great political weight, senators, renowned journalists, and Henry Jacobs himself, who was now part of the commission investigating her. All eyes were on her. What had previously seemed an invincible woman, capable of manipulating the destiny of the country, was now being regarded as a public enemy, a traitor. With a tense smile, Elizabeth entered the room. Her gaze, firm and calculating, did not waver. She knew what was at stake, and at that moment she made a decision no one expected. She would not deny the accusations. She would not try to defend her honor or hide the evidence being presented. Instead, she decided to reveal the whole truth, but not in a conventional way. Elizabeth knew that if convicted, the impact would be irreparable for her allies and for her mission. She needed to reverse the situation, to turn the tables in an unexpected way. Yes, I am connected to foreign figures. And yes, I have conducted secret transactions with Moscow businessmen, but that's not what matters. What matters is that, contrary to what everyone thinks, these alliances were made for a greater good. The United States economy is broken, and we are living a lie, an illusion of prosperity while the masses continue to suffer, Elizabeth declared with impressive calm before taking a strategic pause. What you don't understand is that the system you all defend is bankrupt. Capitalism is condemning the American people to an endless cycle of poverty and hopelessness. I went to Moscow, I spoke with Stalin, because I saw a possibility of changing this system. Perhaps the ways in which I did it weren't the most conventional, but it was necessary, and you know it, everyone knows it. The room fell silent. Elizabeth's words resonated in an unusual way. She wasn't trying to justify herself, she was provoking reflection. She didn't want to be just a victim of the system. She wanted to be the voice that challenged it. Elizabeth's decision to acknowledge her connection to communist figures was a turning point. She no longer tried to hide or deny the truth. Instead, she used it as a weapon, challenging the very system that had marginalized her. Those who expected a traditional defense were stunned by her audacity. Elizabeth had become, at that moment, an even more dangerous figure than any of the accusations leveled against her. But the immediate impact was even stronger. The public was divided. While many saw her as a heroine, someone who was finally telling the truth, others saw a threat that could compromise the nation's future. She had made her choice. Now there was no turning back. The revelation everyone feared was on the table. However, the price of this choice was high. Her political allies began to back away. Charles Montgomery, who had previously been willing to help her, now viewed the situation with skepticism, unsure if he could still associate with someone considered a traitor. Leonid Petrov, who had already warned her about his methods, remained silent, fearful of the consequences of this revelation. What remained for Elizabeth was a growing sense that her journey to change the country's economy would lead her down a path of no return. But this did not discourage her. She knew that despite everything, the real battle was only beginning. Do you think Elizabeth's revelation about her ties to Stalin was the right choice for her? How do you believe this will affect her future and the future of the characters around her? Elizabeth Hartfield's audacious revelation at the Capitol had an impact that reverberated throughout the nation. But the immediate consequences were far more profound than she had imagined. Those who had seen her as a heroine began to doubt her intentions, while her enemies, now with a moral justification to fight her, intensified their campaign against her. Within American politics, the reaction was largely one of shock and condemnation. The government, pressured by public opinion, could no longer ignore the threat Elizabeth represented, nor the implications of her actions. The revelation of her connection to Stalin was seen as treason, an attempt to subvert the fundamental values of American democracy. Journalists, mostly aligned with the establishment, unleashed a wave of articles calling her radical, traitorous, and a threat to capitalism. Henry Jacobs, the ruthless businessman, immediately seized the opportunity. His network of allies, which included conservative politicians and influential Wall Street figures, began to organize a more aggressive action to dismantle Elizabeth's power base. Using his position, Jacobs had the government begin to investigate her finances, her network of contacts, and even her personal life more deeply. For him, the battle was now personal. He wanted to defeat her not only politically, but also socially, ruining her reputation. Within her own network of allies, Elizabeth saw many distancing themselves, especially those concerned about the impact of her actions on the future of the American economy. Charles Montgomery, the politician with whom she had allied herself, was the first to withdraw. Although he had initially approached her because of the power she represented, he now feared that associating with her would be too dangerous for his career. In a tense meeting, he said, "Elizabeth, you may have believed you were doing the right thing, but now all you've done is put us at risk. I can no longer associate with you." These words cut Elizabeth deeply. Montgomery had not only abandoned her, but had also left her in a vulnerable position. She already knew that her closest friends were beginning to distance themselves, but the loss of Montgomery meant a loss of crucial influence in American politics. She was now surrounded by those who once saw her as an ally, and who now viewed her with distrust, or worse, as a threat. Leonid Petrov, however, reacted differently. Although he was also concerned about Elizabeth's direction, he didn't abandon her. Instead, he tried to help her see the error of her choice. He knew that, although she was right about the system's flaws, the path she was now following would not lead her to the transformation she longed for, but to her own destruction. Leonid confronted her not with accusations, but with a sincere reflection. "Elizabeth, you started this to change the system, but now you're losing everything you believed in. You've turned this into a power game, and what's at stake is your own soul." These words deeply affected Elizabeth, who was already beginning to wonder if her fight for justice was being distorted by the seduction of power. But even with this reflection, she didn't know how to stop. The fear of being destroyed by her enemies, coupled with the pride of her own position, pushed her even further forward. The cost of abandoning her project now would be abandoning everything she had achieved up to that point. The public reaction, on the other hand, was polarized. Groups that had previously seen her as a heroine, a woman who defied the system and was finally revealing the truth, began to distance themselves from her. Some, unable to cope with the magnitude of her choice, came to see her as a fraud, someone who took advantage of circumstances to achieve her own goals without considering the greater good. Others, however, began to see her as a martyr, a woman who, despite her mistakes, was still able to show the world the flaws of the capitalist system. While the nation was divided over who Elizabeth truly was, the impact on her personal life was devastating. She no longer had reliable allies, and the pressure on her, both internal and external, was becoming unbearable. Her sleepless nights became more frequent, and doubt began to consume her mind. Could she still achieve the goal she had fought so hard for, or, weighed down by past decisions, was she condemned to be a solitary figure, defeated by her own pride and ambition? However, as her world crumbled around her, Elizabeth began to realize that perhaps there was a way to reverse the situation. If she could reconnect with those who still believed in her original vision, perhaps it would be possible to regain control and rebuild her power base. But this would require humility, something she had never been good at demonstrating. She would need to take a step back and reflect on her true intentions without losing sight of the future she still wished to build. Do you think Elizabeth can recover after all she's lost, or is it too late for her to change her fate? What would you do if you were in her position with so many personal and professional losses? After the events that nearly destroyed her, Elizabeth Hartfield found herself on the brink of collapse. Her rise to power, which had once seemed insurmountable, now appeared an illusion. But the woman who had defied the biggest names in American politics and economics was not ready to give up. Betrayal, loneliness, and the loss of allies had weakened her spirit, but they had also forged it in a way that no one else could understand. Reflecting on her journey was painful. In her moments of solitude, Elizabeth reviewed each step she had taken, each decision that had led her to this point. She began to understand that her desire for power had, at certain times, eclipsed her true mission. She wanted to transform the American economy, but she had lost herself in the process. She became a player in the very game she so vehemently criticized. However, the pain of this self-reflection led her to a new realization. The change she so longed for would not come solely through economic power or political alliances, but primarily through her own inner transformation. She knew that to change the world around her, she would need to change herself. She needed to rediscover herself, distance herself from the manipulators and alliances that had consumed her, and return to her essence. The first step was to take stock of her allies. Although many had distanced themselves, some still believed in her. Leonid Petrov, the only one who had remained by her side during the storm, was the first to approach her again. He had been the only one not to succumb to the fear of losing power and status, and now he saw a new Elizabeth, stronger, more focused. He was clear. Elizabeth, you have lost a lot, but if you can still find your purpose, you can regain what you have lost. But it won't be easy. What you have sought until now is power, but what you need now is truth. These words, spoken with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the revolution and its consequences, marked the starting point for Elizabeth's transformation. She knew that if she truly wanted to change the system, she needed to be more than a figure of power. She needed to be a symbol of resistance and integrity. Initially, Elizabeth considered returning to politics, rebuilding alliances with those who still held power. But she soon realized that the true path lay not behind the curtains of power, but through a more public, more genuine platform. She would then begin to use her experience and knowledge to educate and engage the population directly, without intermediaries. From a simple public speech, she went on to create a network of activists, economists, and citizens who wanted to see the country evolve in a more just and accessible way. However, this path was not without difficulties. Her enemies, now more determined than ever to destroy her, would not give up easily. Henry Jacobs, seeing the threat of Elizabeth resurfacing, tried to counterattack, again manipulating the media to defame her. But Elizabeth, now more strategic and with the help of her new allies, knew exactly how to turn the situation around. She began to respond to the attacks with more concrete actions. She launched wealth redistribution projects, supported labor movements, and even allied herself with some of the most controversial figures of her time to ensure her message was heard. At the same time, Elizabeth was facing her own demons from her journey. She had to grapple with the guilt of having strayed from her ideals in pursuit of power. Although she knew her failings had been profound, she also recognized that without those lessons, she wouldn't have been able to take the next step. Her journey wasn't just about transforming the country, it was about her own evolution, from someone trying to change the world without losing herself in the pursuit of control, to someone who now knew that true change begins within. During the following months, Elizabeth's support base grew. She became a respected public figure, not for her wealth or power, but for her ability to articulate and the sincerity with which she addressed the country's problems. Her mission was now clear. It would no longer be an attempt to replace one system with another. She wished to create a new type of economy, a model that served everyone, that prioritized the well-being of the masses and not just the interests of large corporations. Leonid, who had been her mentor and advisor during her darkest days, became her main ally. Together, they began to form a coalition of intellectuals, workers, and leaders of social movements who shared a single goal: to dismantle the structures that sustained predatory capitalism. Although the path was arduous, Elizabeth now possessed something she lacked before: confidence in her own ability to lead with integrity. However, not everything was resolved. Elizabeth knew that her enemies, especially Jacobs and his allies, were still lurking, ready to attack at any moment. But for the first time, she felt prepared to face any challenge. She knew that the greatest enemy she would face would be weariness and despair, those feelings that had almost defeated her in the past. But she was no longer willing to lose herself. The goal now was greater than any personal ambition. She wanted more than ever to change people's lives and rebuild a country that she believed was possible. Do you believe Elizabeth has found her true purpose, or is she still searching for something greater? What do you think will be the biggest challenge she faces now that she has rediscovered herself? As Elizabeth Hartfield reconnected with her true purpose, tensions in the United States political and economic landscape intensified. She was seen by many as a renewed threat, a leader who could finally achieve the transformation she had promised, but there were also those who saw her as a destabilizer, a dangerous figure who had to be stopped at all costs. Her former allies, now suspicious of her new stance, began to organize against her again. Henry Jacobs, knowing that Elizabeth's threat could no longer be ignored, intensified his campaign. Using his control over the media and his ties to influential politicians, he began spreading rumors that she was trying to incite a violent revolution, an unfounded accusation, but one that gained traction with the growing polarization of the country. The government, seeing Elizabeth as a threat to national stability, began to take drastic measures to neutralize her. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, now focused on her goal of reforming the economy and challenging the power structures she had once embraced, knew she needed to act quickly. Time was against her. External pressure, the growing smear campaign, and constant attacks from her enemies meant that every step had to be calculated with extreme caution. She was on the verge of something grand, but she also risked losing everything she had achieved. Her plan, now more audacious than ever, was to launch a series of economic reforms aimed at redistributing wealth and power, and to implement a new system that prioritized the needs of the people. She knew that the American government and its corporate allies would do everything to stop her, but Elizabeth believed there was an opportunity, a narrow window of time in which her vision could be realized. It was then that she decided to gather all her closest allies, the few who still believed in her cause, and convene a strategic meeting. Among them were Leonid Petrov, her last source of genuine trust, and Margaret, the economist who had always been one of the most fervent defenders of her ideas. Together, they began to plan a bold move, an international economic conference where world leaders would be brought together to discuss a new global economic order. Elizabeth knew that by bringing these key figures together, she would have the chance to pressure not only the United States government, but also international leaders to unite behind her vision. She was aware that the conference would be a minefield, where allies could be turned into enemies and where her own credibility would be tested to the extreme. But this was the only opportunity to make change happen. As preparations for the conference progressed, Elizabeth faced an internal psychological battle. The confidence she had begun to rebuild was constantly being shaken by attacks from enemies, unfounded rumors, and political pressures. She knew that if she failed now, there would be no turning back. The risk of being exposed and destroyed by the forces she herself had helped to create had never been more real. Despite this, Elizabeth was determined. She knew that her battle was not merely a matter of power or politics. It was a matter of ideals, of a system she believed to be fundamentally flawed and in need of transformation for the good of the people. And looking at her allies, she realized that finally she was no longer alone. The conference she planned to organize would not merely be a gathering of elites, but a stage for change. Elizabeth wanted to use that moment to expose the flaws of the capitalist system and also to present a new economic model that was not based on exploitation, but rather on global collaboration, social justice, and the redistribution of wealth. To do this, she knew she would need to convince the world that her vision was not only necessary, but urgent. She also began secretly working on a speech that would be both powerful and provocative, something that would shake the perceptions of the masses and the leaders present. She knew the world was at a turning point, and that her ability to influence that change would depend on how she presented herself at the event. She would no longer be just the woman who had made mistakes and lost her way. She would be the leader of a new movement, someone willing to risk everything for a better future. The days that followed were filled with constant tension. Preparations for the conference were at their peak, and the net was closing in on Elizabeth. Her enemies, now more organized than ever, began to devise a strategy to publicly discredit her and end her campaign before she had a chance to act. Elizabeth knew the moment of truth was approaching, and she was willing to do anything to ensure her vision was heard. The game was on her terms now, and the conference would be her last chance to prove to the world that the change she proposed was possible. Do you believe Elizabeth is truly prepared to handle the pressure of the conference and the resistance from her enemies? What do you think might happen when she finally faces the world in her greatest battle? The International Economic Conference, which Elizabeth Hartfield had planned with such care and audacity, was finally about to take place. The Grand Conference Hall in New York was packed with world-renowned political, economic, and intellectual figures. The tension in the air was palpable, with journalists from all corners of the globe anxiously awaiting the arrival of the key leaders, and, of course, Elizabeth. She had become a divisive figure. For some, a revolutionary, a woman willing to challenge the system to bring a new order to the world. For others, a traitor, someone willing to put the country and even the world at risk to satisfy her own ambitions. But at that moment, the world didn't know what to expect from her. Elizabeth had stayed out of the spotlight for weeks, preparing a presentation that would be not just a speech, but a reality check. She knew that her last chance to truly change things was right there, on that stage. The room was completely silent when Elizabeth stepped onto the stage. She was tense, but at the same time aware of the weight of her mission. Looking at the audience, her eyes swept over each face, leaders who were once allies, politicians who had distanced themselves from her, and those who were ready to use her as a symbol of their own agenda. But deep down, she knew that what she was about to say could change the destiny not only of herself, but of everyone present. She took a deep breath and began. "I am not here to apologize. I am not here to redeem myself. I am here because you, all of you, know that the system that has governed the world for the last few centuries is broken. It has failed, and failed catastrophically. And I am the first to admit that, in my pursuit of power, I allowed myself to be seduced by that very system. But now, I am here to do what no one has dared to do, confront the truth." The room remained in absolute silence. Some, especially those connected to large corporations and the government, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed intrigued by the sincerity in Elizabeth's words. "I'm not here to promote a violent revolution, as many want to portray me. No, I am here to propose a new model, a new economy. Not an economy based on relentless profit and exploitation, but an economy that values people, that prioritizes well-being over corporate interests. An economy that redistributes wealth and holds the powerful accountable for their contribution to society." Elizabeth paused, observing the audience's reaction. Most were still in shock, but some were already beginning to lean toward her, curious about the proposal she was about to reveal. "I know you fear this. I know the powerful fear this change. But the truth is, however much they try to convince us that capitalism is the only solution, it is leading the world to destruction. What we are experiencing is not prosperity, it is an illusion. And this illusion is about to crumble unless we do something now." She approached the microphone, her eyes now fixed on the world leaders and the audience of journalists. "The truth is, we can no longer pretend that everything is all right. And if that means going against everything I've built, then so be it. Because in the end, what matters is the future of the next generations. What matters is the life of every human being, not the profits of a minority that manipulates the system to benefit at the expense of others." The tension in the room was growing. Elizabeth knew her words were igniting a flame that could end her career or finally ignite the revolution she so desperately desired. She passed the microphone to one of her allies, Leonid, who was in the audience, and he stood up, ready to reinforce her proposal with more details. It was at that moment that the unexpected happened. A journalist from a major media outlet, directly linked to Henry Jacobs and his allies, abruptly stood up and fired off a question. "Elizabeth, you say you're fighting for the people, but how can you trust that those who support you truly have the purest intentions? Don't you see that you can be manipulated as you have been in the past? How can we believe someone who has already been responsible for so many questionable alliances?" The room was tense. All eyes were on Elizabeth, awaiting her answer. She knew this was the crucial point. The game was at its peak, and once again she would have to choose between her true mission and the shadows of her past. With a subtle smile, she replied, "Yes, I was manipulated. I made mistakes, and I went too far. But now, it's different. I know what's at stake, and I won't let anyone use me. What I propose is not just a political or economic change. It's a revolution in understanding how we should live. And yes, I put myself at the forefront of this revolution, knowing that the challenges are immense. But I also have something that many here don't have, the truth on my side." She looked at the audience, and the words echoed in the room. "I am not here to be a martyr. I am here to be the founder of a new world, and if necessary, I will fight for it to the end." The room fell into absolute silence. The tension that had begun to dissipate was now replaced by a feeling of expectation, almost palpable. Elizabeth had played her last card, and now there was no turning back. Do you believe Elizabeth managed to convince the audience and that her message will be able to transform the system, or is she just beginning to face the greatest challenges of her life? The New York conference ended, but the impact of Elizabeth Hartfield's words continued to reverberate around the world. The following morning's news broadcasts were filled with heated discussions about her speech and her proposal for a new economy. For many, she had become the leader of a revolution, but the revolution was not yet complete. She had only taken the first step, and the path ahead was uncertain and full of obstacles. After the event, Elizabeth withdrew from the public eye for a while. She knew the battle was far from over. The United States government, with the support of its allies in the private sector, was not going to give in easily. The media, which had so often promoted her failings, was now beginning to reverse its tone. Some journalists began to question whether Elizabeth had, in fact, touched on something important, something the country needed to hear. However, the real battle wasn't in politics or the palaces of power. Elizabeth's struggle now was with ideas, with the vision of a new economy. The reforms she proposed wouldn't be easy to implement. There was resistance from all sides, but for the first time she felt she was fighting for something bigger than herself. She was no longer after a place in power, nor was she trying to assert herself as an authority figure. Her mission now was to build something lasting, something that would benefit everyone, not just a privileged elite. Meanwhile, her former allies, such as Leonid and Margaret, remained by her side. They too were committed to the cause, helping to create a broader movement aimed at reforming the system from within. The people began to mobilize. Grassroots movements began to emerge. Those who had previously felt powerless in the face of the economic system began to unite around Elizabeth's cause, seeing in her not just a leader of empty promises, but a true visionary. Elizabeth, now more cautious and more focused on her intentions, began working on her final strategy: to mobilize a coalition of citizens, workers, and intellectuals who would support the proposed reforms, and to ensure that the new order she envisioned had the necessary support to resist those who would try to destroy it. But at the same time, she knew that the transformation wouldn't be easy. Those who held power, who benefited from the structures she wanted to destroy, wouldn't surrender without a fight. And eventually she would find herself facing a crucial choice. Should she continue her fight, knowing the costs it would bring to her personal and professional life, or retreat and accept that her vision was perhaps too big to achieve? Only time would tell. Elizabeth's future and her vision of a new world was yet to be written. She had begun the journey as a woman seeking power, but now she saw herself as a leader of a greater cause. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that no matter what happened, she had given everything she could. The impact of her choices would still be felt for a long time, but she was willing to live with the consequences. For now, she understood that in the end, true wealth did not come from power, but from the real change one could create for people. Do you believe Elizabeth will be able to carry out her reforms, or will she face obstacles that could destroy her? What will be the biggest challenge for her now that her speech and vision are at the center of the debate? Years later, Elizabeth Hartfield remained a legendary figure in American history. Her vision of a new economy was not easily realized, but gradually she and her allies managed to change how the country viewed its institutions. Although the battle was arduous and full of losses, the movement for economic justice and redistribution of power continued to grow, inspiring new generations to fight for the common good. Elizabeth, now older and more reflective, saw the impact of her journey in each gradual change. The future was still uncertain, but her struggle had somehow planted the seeds of change. How do you think Elizabeth will be remembered by future generations? How did she change history, even if the results weren't immediate? Now that you've followed Elizabeth Hartfield's journey and her fight to change the system, we want to know what you think. Did her story inspire you? Do you believe she could have truly transformed the country? Or perhaps you have your own ideas about the future she envisioned. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us how you would interpret Elizabeth's fate. Is true change within reach of anyone who has the courage to fight for it? Let's discuss it together.